This video was brought to you by NordVPN. For the last couple of months, the front lines in Ukraine have been relatively stable, and despite rumors of a major Russian offensive, not much has changed. And at the time of writing, the Russians are still yet to fully capture Bakhmut. However, the Ukrainians have made it clear that they're not happy with the status quo, and there have been reports from both American and Ukrainian officials that Kyiv is eyeing a counteroffensive sometime later this year. So, in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the potential offensive, where it might go, what it might succeed, and what might happen if it did. So far, Putin's invasion has been a pretty stunning failure. Russian forces have been pushed out of Kharkiv and Kherson, and they're still yet to capture all of Donbass, which many analysts consider to be the bare minimum for the Kremlin. However, in the last couple of months, as the front lines have stabilized and the war has become increasingly attritional, the balance of power has shifted in Russia's favor. That's because Ukraine's earlier victories in Kherson and Kharkiv were won by their superior intel, often provided by the US, and by exploiting Russia's overextended logistics lines. However, now that Russia has retreated, its supply lines are shorter and its troop concentration is denser, meaning that there's less opportunity for counteroffensives going forward. The Russian army has also learned from its earlier mistakes and reverted to old-fashioned trench warfare gains. So while it might not be pretty, this has essentially turned Ukraine into a war of attrition, and that suits the Russians because, well, Russia just has more ammo and more men. Conscious of this fact, the Ukrainians have apparently decided that they need to change the status quo, with multiple reports that the Ukrainians and the US are currently discussing a new offensive later this year in order to break the attritional deadlock. Now, the most likely time for this seems to be sometime in the middle of the year, around late spring or early summer, because by then the Russian army should be relatively exhausted from their ongoing offensive in Donbass, and more Western supplies, including Leopard tanks and the US's new long-range ground-launched small-diameter bombs, should have arrived on the battlefield. On top of that, some 20,000 Ukrainian troops, representing about 10% of the Ukrainian army, are currently being trained in NATO countries, and most of these people will likely have returned by the spring. So, if this new offensive does happen, then where will the Ukrainians go? Well, as we see it, there are broadly two options for the Ukrainians: the east around Donbass, and the south around Melitopol. Let's start with the east. If the Ukrainians were to stage an offensive in the east, the most likely target would be the Svatov-Kreminna line. Now, Svatov and Kreminna are two relatively small towns. Both also lie on the Kharkiv-Luhansk border, and they're joined by the P66 motorway. Now, while these might be small towns, they are strategically important because a lot of Russian supplies running from Belgorod and other supply depots in western Russia down to a number of important towns in Ukraine run through these two towns. This means that if the Ukrainians can recapture either town or just cut off the P66, they can put pressure on Russia's logistics operation in the east. Now, this would be particularly good news given that the Russian army, and especially the Wagner Group, seem to be building some momentum around Bakhmut. Regardless, the Ukrainians have been prodding around this area for a while now, but in that time, the Russians have shored up their defenses in the area, with pro-Russian forces apparently building fortifications since 2014. So it looks like the Ukrainians will require a larger offensive if they actually want to make any significant gains. As such, any offensive in the east wouldn't be easy, and the Ukrainian forces in the area will already be exhausted after Bakhmut. And that's why the majority of analysts think the most likely place for the next Ukrainian offensive will be in the south. Here there are more options for the Ukrainians though, but the most tempting would be to move south from Zaporizhia towards Melitopol. Not only is Melitopol a major supply route, the city sits at the intersection of two major highways and a crucial rail line, but if the Ukrainians were to take it, they could split Russian forces in the south, isolating those Russians in Kherson Oblast to the west of Melitopol. Again though, this would be a big ask. Russian positions around here are pretty well fortified, and splitting the Russians could leave the Ukrainians at risk of encirclement. But it's still probably a better bet than the East. But if the Ukrainians do go for a counteroffensive later in the year, what will they need to do to succeed? Well, while tanks and armoured vehicles are definitely going to be useful, perhaps the most important thing for Ukraine's future success is ammunition. And this isn't a new problem either. Kyiv has been complaining about a lack of ammunition for a while now, and there have been reports that Ukrainian troops have been put on an ammo diet, or specifically an artillery shell diet, to conserve supplies. In fact, Ukraine's defense minister told his EU counterparts in a recent letter obtained by the Financial Times that his army was limited to about 120,000 artillery shells a month, just 20% of what they'd ordinarily used. Now, the US and Eastern and Northern European states have already pledged to increase production, but the Ukrainians are still getting through more shells than NATO can produce. As a result, Ukraine's best bet here is the EU, which is currently considering using the EU budget or some other intra-EU funding vehicle to buy millions of shells for Ukraine and stimulate domestic ammo production in Europe. If this works, it could be a game changer for Ukraine. Not only would this provide them with the means to stage another offensive, but it would also allow them to compete with the Russians in attritional contexts, assuming that Western support really does hold up. So if all of this happens, if the counteroffensive does indeed succeed, what happens next? Well, it'll obviously be good news for Ukraine. Not just because it will mean more territory, but also because it will shore up flagging support in the West, where enthusiasm for the war is on the wane. Conversely, it would also be terrible news for Putin and the Russian army, who haven't fared so well in the war thus far. It would, however, also likely provoke some sort of escalation, like maybe another round of mobilization in Russia or greater military cooperation with China. But it would be especially bad news for Putin if the Ukrainians made progress in the south, because a successful offensive on Melitopol would set the stage for a siege in Crimea, which is something that Putin really couldn't accept. Now, to be clear, this is quite a distant hypothetical. A successful Ukrainian counteroffensive is by no means guaranteed, and sweeping advances like those we saw in Kharkiv and Kherson are unlikely at this stage in the conflict. Regardless, we'll be sure to keep you updated, so make sure you subscribe to TLDR EU. A couple of years ago, I was a victim of identity theft, and I only found out when a letter from the court came through my door saying that I owed a bunch of money to a broadband company for an address I'd never even lived at. After a bunch of legal back and forth, I was forced to pay the money that I allegedly owed just to try and make the problem go away. But from then on, I was determined to make sure that I wasn't caught out again. And as such, I took a number of steps, including signing up for NordVPN. Now, you surely already know that NordVPN is the world's fastest virtual private network. But you might not know that they have a whole suite of threat protection features too. In fact, NordVPN's threat protection shields you from all kinds of dangerous things online, blocking malware, trackers, and malicious ads to help prevent you from falling victim to any of these scams or phishing attacks. Not only that, they also have a dark web monitoring service. So even if your data were to fall into the wrong hands, they'd scour the dark web to notify you when someone shares, leaks, or sells your details. Hopefully meaning that you'd find out what was going on before a court order lands on your doorstep. Now, ultimately, this isn't a fun thing to think about, but trust me, it's a whole lot less fun when it becomes a reality. Also, it's not just other people that this happens to. I hope you'll agree that I'm a reasonably smart person, and I did a computer science degree, and I still got. So, click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. So, thanks for your support, and make sure you click the link in the description.